So, just so everybody knows, so Paula, Courtney, I think everybody probably knows her because she's judged rabbits, right? And lives in Godley, Texas, obviously very close to most of us here. Very interesting thing about Paula, though, that I think, and I'd like to learn more about it, Paula. She works in the disinfectants world, if you would, and I think especially in the poultry and the swine businesses, right, Paula? So. And especially as we talk about RHDV2, all the impacts associated that, I think we're very fortunate to have a specialist in our midst that is a part of the rabbit world. So, Paula, we're going to turn it over to you, but we really, really appreciate you being on board tonight. So.
Yeah, no problem. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Thanks, guys, for having me. I've got quite a few slides to go through. Biosecurity is a pretty big topic, so I'm going to jump right into it, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. But I'm going to be presenting on implementing a biosecurity program for your rabbitry. And as John mentioned, I'm an ARBA judge, but I'm also the director of animal health for a sanitation chemical company called Sterilex. So I do work a lot with poultry and swine producers, and I do a lot of biosecurity training for my job.
Awesome.
So lots of stuff to cover, so I'll jump right into it, but we'll start out with some definitions and then some challenges associated with biosecurity, talk about risk assessment, developing a plan, and then some of the key areas of biosecurity programs such as entryway control, cleaning and disinfection, rodent control, insect control, and water quality. So this is a very basic definition of biosecurity, but as it applies to us, it's a series of management practices designed to prevent the introduction and spread of disease agents. So generally, we're trying to prevent disease. Biosecurity can also apply to preventing some foodborne illness and food pathogens as well. So whenever I do biosecurity training, I like to get people in the mindset that we're thinking about all these different areas that apply and pertain to biosecurity as building blocks. So they're really all important, and the program doesn't work if you ignore certain areas. So these 14 biosecurity principles are the National Poultry Improvement Plan biosecurity principles. Obviously, avian influenza is a disease that we've heard a lot about. Maybe it's been several years since it's been a big deal, but it affects the poultry industry greatly, and they've done a very excellent job over the years of really building out programs and doing auditing that is associated with those programs to make sure that they're preventing avian influenza outbreaks from affecting their facilities. And so you can draw a lot of parallels to what they're doing and what we want to try to do in the rabbit industry to protect our herds. So these 14 areas are what they detail out in all of their biosecurity programs. And so I think this is a really good guiding point and template for us as we start to look at what we can apply into our rabbit hobby. So with this image, you can see I've got these kind of laid out like bricks. And as I mentioned before, all of the areas are important. Some of them are going to apply to us in rabbits a little bit more than others. But if there is one weak point in the foundation, what happens when we have this collapse of the program, failure of the program, and you start to have disease breaks, not just RHDV, but we also deal with E. coli in rabbits. You can deal with Pasteurella. Obviously, we're familiar with those. We've been familiar with those in the past. They're just a little bit lower risk threats than RHDV2. And so we haven't necessarily designed biosecurity programs or detailed them out around those types of diseases, but that is part of this. So we're trying to prevent the building from collapsing. And as I mentioned, why do we care about this? Well, right now, there's a big draw for everyone to increase their education on biosecurity and really understand what can be implemented, what they can afford to implement, what makes the most sense for their specific rabbitry design and what they can afford. And so RHDV2 has really created this big hype around the topic of biosecurity. There's a lot of panic right now, a lot of confusion. You know, we just want to kind of go through and talk about different areas and what can be implemented, and try to really take a logical approach to what can be done until we have affordable vaccines here in the US. So there's been a lot of negativity lately on social media. Obviously, ARBA is getting a lot of phone calls about this. There's a lot of arguments about whether or not shows should be happening, things like that. I've personally heard a lot of people talking about how expensive biosecurity is and that they can't afford to implement it, so they just want to sell out of rabbits. I've heard people talk about how impossible it is to kill every fly in your facility, and so if you can't knock them all down, then there's no point to invest in any type of a program. Heard people talking about foot baths and that they don't work unless you stand in them for 10 minutes. I actually hear that once in a while in my job in poultry and swine industries as well. So we can go into some of those misconceptions and in a little bit later on in the presentation. I've also heard that, you know, there's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum where people are just basically saying that they're not going to be affected by RHGV2. They're not worried about it at all. And then, of course, we have the people who are panicking and they're almost in paralysis and can't make decisions about anything because they think the world is ending. And so really, I'm hoping through this presentation, I can just give people a few tools on how they can start thinking about different pieces that they can implement and kind of just systematically, step by step, start to build a more biosecure facility and just make better management decisions and make better practices as far as allowing visitors and things like that at their facility. And if we're all, you know, we're all dealing with this together, and so anything that you can implement at your own rabbitry obviously is for the benefit of the entire industry because we all need to work together to help protect each other's rabbits and herds as well. So I've heard this as a definition of biosecurity, and this gets talked about a lot, but when we start to think about, you know, the expense of these additional management practices and products that we might want to purchase for a biosecurity program, I like to talk about it as an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so we do need to take a moment and think about for ourselves what our rabbitry is worth to us and what that herd is worth to us. And I know maybe we're not all super awesome at budgeting and looking at the money and income from our rabbitry hobby or our expenses, but we all need to sit down and think about what amount of risk are we willing to take, and what can we budget towards biosecurity to try to protect our herd. Obviously with RHGV2, if your herd does break, it's very likely you're not going to have rabbits anymore for quite some time. So taking a moment to think about what it's worth to you and what you can afford and how that's going to balance. And I think that's really where the key is, right? Because you're going to put into it, you're going to get out of it as much as you put into it. And spending a little bit of money here on some disinfectants or foot pans or different biosecurity tools could go a long way in preventing your herd from breaking if RHGV2 reaches your area. So with that, I've got a couple of slides on risk assessment, because I think this is super important, and it's also a way to help make biosecurity programs a little bit more affordable or accessible to more people. So we want to always be mindful that the risk is not going to be the same throughout or constantly throughout the whole year. So like I mentioned, you want to be realistic about what level of risk overall at the worst time of year in the biggest disease threat are you willing to take or assume. What can you afford to spend, but what are your goals and expectations? So we all need to be realistic about this. And obviously, right, so all of these blocks that I have listed here are different types of biosecurity measures. And I also, like I described it as a foundation or building blocks, biosecurity can also be described as like an onion. So there's layers, right? You can always keep doing more and more and more things. And the more things you do, the more protected you're going to be. But at some point, it's unrealistic and no one's going to follow that protocol. So for example, right, if you can have an enclosed building, that's really ideal. If you can get netting and put netting around an open rabbitry, that's helpful. It's one tool that's going to help you. I'm a really big advocate for entryway control. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but having a foot bath at your entry point is important, but managing that foot bath appropriately. You might also have a footwear change after you walk through a foot bath, and that gives you added security. So each additional step that you take is going to help reduce your level of risk, but there is no silver bullet and there's no guarantee that you won't break even if you're doing all the right things. So it's all about assessing your risk and limiting that risk as much as possible. So how does this apply to us as we start to build out a program? Well, I really liked, as I got thinking about this and what the poultry industry does, is they do have different risk levels that they'll assess what the risk is at a certain given time, and then they'll adjust their biosecurity measures and add layers, for example, during more higher risk times of year. So if we think about it like Smokey the Bear, right, he tells you when the fire danger is low, and then it's usually a green sign, and then he'll tell you if it's moderate risk or high risk. And so we can use this same type of line of thought to apply it to biosecurity and RHDV2. And I put together this flow chart, and this is my personal opinion. Everyone needs to make these decisions and what they're wanting to do as far as what level, if it's going to be green, yellow, or red that they want to be in, and how many layers their biosecurity program are they going to have at any given time of the year. But I put this together just as a basic model or example to show you what types of decisions or factors are going to affect what your risk level is, including the season. RHDV2 historically in other countries is known to really peak during the breeding season in spring and early summer. Generally, it's a much lower risk in the winter, a little bit lower in the fall and late summer. And so time of year is really going to affect what level you're at in your program. If it's been confirmed in your state within 60 days is going to affect where you're at. If it's currently show season, if you're attending shows or if you're choosing not to attend shows, how many miles you are from an outbreak, and if that outbreak that's been identified was in wild rabbit populations or domestic rabbit populations, because that does make a difference, right? If it's somebody's rabbitry that breaks and the rabbits were euthanized and everything was disposed of appropriately, that's a much more controlled situation than if it's wild rabbits that have been tested and confirmed positive. So that does definitely affect your risk level as well. And so, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I just had a question. You mentioned other countries, the types of the year, so it's more, bigger outbreaks happen in cooler weathers. Is that what you were saying? Or is it in, or?
No, generally they follow breeding season. And so when there's more, generally in wild rabbit populations, right? So factors like importing rabbits or not being able, unidentified sources of where the disease came from. We don't know as much about that, but in general, it does follow breeding season because it's when the wild populations are having more contact, it's going to spread more rapidly. So that's just historic information. Obviously, this is the first year that we're really seeing this in the US in wild populations, and so it's going to be a learning situation for all of us, but we can definitely hope that it will slow down once we get into late summer or fall. But yes, as we're looking at this and these different levels now, this is how we can start building out our biosecurity program, but also managing the cost of biosecurity program. and what we're going to budget for it depending on maybe the time of year and if our state is currently affected, and especially, you know, if there's wild rabbit populations within 150 miles of you that have confirmed cases. So we move this into starting to build out the program, and I could present probably for 5 hours on actually detailing out a full program, but I've included some resources on one of the last slides. There is a template on the NPIP template on helping poultry producers and compliance officers start to build out a program and what that looks like and what areas they should be detailing out. And so I will provide that link so people can take a look at it to start and create your own program. But in general, when we're looking at level 1, even if you're at low risk, I think because RHGV is here and it probably will be a continued threat in future years, we probably all need to start implementing at least some basic measures. And so for me, that's entryway control measures, you know, boot disinfection when I walk in the facility, insect control program. I had one of those previously, just in general, which I think is good practice for everyone, especially from a sanitation standpoint. I had a rodent control program in place, and we're going to talk about that, but rodent control is very important. Both rodents and insects can transfer a lot of pathogens from outdoors into a facility. And then additionally, you can require visitors to potentially wear boot covers or disinfect their footwear as well. Was there a question?
No, I think it was just my son. Sorry. So.
Oh, okay, no problem. And then when we get into level 2, you're just going to heighten all of those original measures, and then you might add a boot change program, might limit visitors completely from your facility, might limit new animals being brought in. You want to look at water sanitization and also sanitizing any type of items that you're bringing into the facility, potentially including feed bags. At level 3, high risk, you want to have no visitors to your facility. You might even want to do coveralls or a clothing change. Additional measures taken to enclose your barn, paying attention to where you're driving, doing additional vehicle washes and disinfectant stages. So different things that you can add, and obviously your level 3, we're talking about much higher expenses and more intensive programs. It's going to be a lot more labor intensive and a pain, and people don't want to do it, but that's what you need to do to protect your herd when the threat is at a very high risk level. Level 1 and 2 may be less inconvenient. Level 1 can be implemented at relatively low cost, and so that's something that really everyone can start looking at doing. This is a photo of my entryway into my barn, of what I put together when we first started getting cases of RHGV2 in Texas, called what we call a Danish entry system. Generally in poultry and swine, we'll see a Danish entry actually has a physical barrier, like a bench that you're going to sit down on and swing your feet over to do a footwear change or disinfectant. But the line, or definite line and mark where there's a dirty side and a clean side is what really makes that a Danish entry. So I've got this metal racking that I put up so that I can put disinfecting wipes, hand sanitizer, and aerosol disinfectant on. I also have a Rubbermaid container for additional products. I can put a pair of shoes in there, a boot change if I want to, so that I don't have to worry about spiders and things like that, because a lot of people have asked about that. And then I have a foot pan with some disinfectant powder in it. Just some basic things that can be done to really help with your entryway control. Make sure that we're not bringing anything from the grass, that potentially areas where wild rabbits and birds and other animals were moving that I walked through would come into my facility. So really paying attention to this type of a setup. This is very basic, minimal expense. I've got a lot of different disinfectant products here, but really you could just have 1 or 2. Hand sanitizer is important as well, and we all know that that's relatively inexpensive, or it's starting to become easier to find. So When we talk about entryway control in biosecurity in general, there's two biosecurity lines. They're called the perimeter buffer area and the line of separation. These are really important to pay attention to. You'll read about them a lot if you start looking at some of the biosecurity resources that pertain to swine and poultry industries. But the line of separation is your last line of defense before you get into where your rabbits are. So that's where your biosecurity measures are going to be the most extreme. You're going to have the most steps, maybe washing your hands, hand sanitizer, boot changes, foot pans, all of that stuff. You want it to be the most extreme right before you cross over that line of separation into your rabbitry area. The perimeter buffer area is potentially where your program really starts, and that's where it's basically a line around your property or even just around your backyard area, wherever your barn is. And that's where you're going to limit who's driving up to your barn, anyone that's going into that perimeter buffer area, any equipment that you bring into that perimeter buffer area, especially anything that would have been in contact with other rabbits or any area that has currently an RHDV outbreak. You really want to make sure it's getting disinfected before it enters into the PDA. These are some entryway control products that I use in my rabbitry and that I recommend in general. They're very good disinfectants. One of the challenges that we have with RHDV2 is that in the US, rabbits aren't super profitable business as far as big pharma and disinfectant companies are concerned. And so there's not a lot of investment in rabbit-specific diseases on product labels, and so the USDA has made some recommendations on products that will be effective on RHDV2. It is a calicivirus, and so non-enveloped, they are pretty challenging to inactivate, but a lot of these products do fall within a category where if it was deemed an emerging pathogen, they would be approved for it, or there's some research backing the fact that they would be successful at inactivating RHDV2, or they have other caliciviruses on the label. So the things that we want to look for and use in our programs for entryway control. This slide has a lot of text on it, but I provided this because it's really important information, and I get a ton of questions from people about what products to use. So really want to drive this point home, is that anything that's labeled as a detergent, soap, cleaner, or hygiene product is not EPA registered. So that means that the Environmental Protection Agency has not approved data stating that it can kill bacteria or microorganisms or inactivate viruses. And so when we're talking about the disinfection or sanitization steps in a biosecurity program, you really want to look for EPA regulated or EPA registered products that have the word disinfectant or sanitizer on the label and that have disease pathogens on the label as well. So that means that you're going to be a little bit more confident that you're actually getting appropriate log reduction of microorganisms when you're applying that product. I had on our misconception slide that a lot of people talk about needing to stand in a foot pan for 10 minutes. And so I just want to take a moment to talk about contact time and what that means. So when something is EPA registered, it means that there's a lot of data that went into getting those claims and proving that efficacy against a specific organism. So all testing when you're generating data is log reduction of the microorganism or bacteria, for example, within a certain time frame. So there always is a contact time that's associated with any type of efficacy claims on a disinfectant or sanitizer. So the most minimum or the accepted contact time and what you're going to see almost 100% of the time on disinfectants is going to be a 10-minute contact time. So you're always going to, in your mind, think about it as if I want to get a full 6 log reduction of bacteria or microorganisms, which is 99.9999% reduction, then it needs to be a minimum contact time of 10 minutes. So you want the surface wet with that disinfectant for 10 minutes. If you only have a contact time of, say, 2 minutes or 5 minutes, that doesn't mean that you're not inactivating virus or killing bacteria. It means that you're not going to be guaranteed a 6-log full reduction. So just to make that point clear, there is a lot of false information on social media lately that if you stand or walk through a foot pan, nothing is happening. That's not true. The other piece of that is that as you walk through something, the idea is that you get that product onto your footwear, and it actually does remain on your footwear, which allows you to get closer to that contact time versus actually needing to submerge your footwear in the product for the full contact time. So it is different ways to think about that, but wanted to really clarify that point because there's a lot of confusion right now about it. Sanitizer is also associated with the contact time. You'll often see that associated with a shorter time, maybe 3 minutes. A lot of times you'll see 5 or 10, but that's a 3-log reduction, so 99.9% of microorganisms will be killed or inactivated using a sanitizer. So just to clarify that, if people do have further questions about that, we can answer them at the end, but that is something that is very confusing to a lot of people, and so I wanted to make sure everyone kind of understands that because it's a big part of cleaning and disinfection. Other part of cleaning and disinfection that livestock producers hate is that there is actually a lot of steps to doing a proper sanitation process. In food processing, it's more steps than this. They have a lot of verification steps, and they'll also sanitize after they disinfect. But this is what I generally recommend as a best practice for any type of livestock producer. This applies to cleaning any equipment, especially cleaning equipment that came through an area affected with RHDV, or any equipment coming from a different rabbitry, right? We're not always going to use all of these steps when we're just disinfecting things at our house or in our barn, but it's important to understand the process that you need to go through to get the highest log reduction of bacteria or inactivation of viruses that you possibly can. So dry cleaning, picking up debris, manual soil removal, very important first step. Then you want to pressure wash. You want to get rid of as much organic matter as you can with wet cleaning step. That does include using a soap or detergent to try and break up some of that soil. You can't disinfect manure and organic matter, so don't leave a dirty cage and spray disinfectant on it and expect it to not have virus or bacteria on it, because that's just not the reality. You also cannot disinfect dirt. So if you read anything that says you can disinfect your lawn from RHDV2, don't waste your money doing that. It's not going to be effective. You want to rinse after you use a soap. Then you allow surfaces to drain and dry. It's important to not apply disinfectant to wet standing water or wet surfaces because you over dilute and then you're not going to get the efficacy you want. Inspecting the surface, making sure it looks clean, and then applying your disinfectant. And these are best practices. You may or may not rinse your disinfectant. In general, in livestock production, we don't rinse disinfectants because you risk recontaminating the surface after application. This is a resource from the Center for Food Security and Public Health. I've provided a link at the end of the presentation, but they have a lot of excellent resources on that site about disinfectants and bacteria and viruses in general. This just shows you where you can find an EPA registration number when you're looking at product labels, and then also it shows you where you can find the organisms that the product is effective against. So it's a really important resource when you start to look at what you want to use in a biosecurity program. As I mentioned, RHDV2 is a non-enveloped virus, and so this chart just shows you the susceptibility of different types of microorganisms to chemical disinfectants. Different types of chemical disinfectants can be more effective or less effective in different areas within this chart, but this is just the general reality. I think we kind of all know from experience that coccidia is not fun, and so that is obvious. As you can see here, it is the most resistant. It's a very challenging organism to battle with. That's why a lot of us use preventative measures rather than trying to treat it and disinfect afterwards. Non-enveloped viruses are going to be more difficult to inactivate than enveloped viruses. For example, COVID is an enveloped virus, so RHDV is hardier in the environment than that. And then different bacteria are lower down on here, and mycoplasmas are most susceptible. So this is just a good resource, and the point here is really to pay attention to product labels and kind of get a better understanding of what you're using. Don't just start throwing chemicals everywhere, because it's not going to be the most effective or cost effective for you when we're looking at implementing biosecurity. So I will touch on rodent control, and I've got a lot of friends that do rodent control. This is a whole topic on its own, but I've kind of picked out the highest level stuff that I think will get people thinking and really enough information to kind of scratch the surface. So there's 3 different types of rodents that we commonly battle. We have all 3 of these in Texas. The roof rat, which is, I think, kind of what, Disney and some of the other movies have based their rat characters after. But these like to be higher up, as the name suggests. They like to be in rafters. They like to nest in attics, things like that. They do really prefer warmer climates, and they are most common in East Texas. So when you start to get, probably Tyler area and east, I'm sure there could be some around here, but generally, I'm really close to, I live in Godley, close to Cleburne area. We really have more of the Norway rats here. So that's going to be a really, really common one. And those are the ones that like to burrow under concrete slabs, do a lot of nesting in wall voids and down lower. As you can see from the photo, they look a little bit different. They look a little closer to a mouse, actually, so they can be confused, but they're bigger, and they create a lot more of a mess. And then we do have mice. They're a little bit rounder faces, a little bit rounder and bigger in their ears. You can see the differences from the photos. Mice generally will have a smaller range of area that they cover. When we're looking at rats, under extreme conditions, they can range up to even 400-foot diameter territory. So we want to just kind of have a really good understanding of what the type of pest is that we're dealing with. And there are different ways to identify these, not just from where you're seeing the burrows and things like that, or the nesting. There's different ways that you can actually identify them by the shapes of their droppings, different marks that they're leaving, food preferences, things like that. And so if you're having challenges, there are people that you can reach out to, but generally, understanding if you've got rodents that are kind of burrowing down low versus having them up in the rafters, that is going to affect your rodent control strategies that you implement at your facility. So second step to starting this program is that you really want to investigate. So if you've got rodents, you've seen some signs, like you might not see them on a regular basis, but if you see droppings, you certainly have them. You might even have droppings in an empty rabbit dish that had a little extra feed in it, something like that. That's a problem because, as we mentioned earlier, rodents are a huge vector for a lot of disease. You don't want them anywhere near the food or water that your animals might be eating, because they can transfer a lot of pathogens and viruses that way. So, all rodents have 3 critical needs: food, water, and harborage or shelter. So you're looking for signs of that, right? We all have rabbits. Obviously, rabbits are very messy eaters, and there are always extra pellets in different places. Even if you sweep every day, it's a never-ending battle, right? So rodents have definitely an excellent food source when it comes to areas where we're raising rabbits. Mice can actually get all of their water needs from their food, and so they won't actually go and seek out additional water, but rats absolutely need to have a good water source. So they could be drinking out of your water crocks for your rabbits. If you've got a leaky faucet or something like that, that's all that they need. So looking for kind of where they're looking as far as their food and water, you can identify some harborage areas. That's going to help with your strategy and getting rid of them. And getting the information and kind of understanding where your problem is kind of the second step before you start to actually implement some control methods, which is our action step. So absolutely, you want to try to remove any harborage areas you can. You want to block off holes. Rodents can chew through aluminum, but they can't chew through steel. So kind of think about that when you're looking at how to block off areas that they are using for passage or harborage. Make sure you clean up extra feed and trash and things around that they're using for nesting materials. You don't want that around because it's just going to attract more rodents because you're creating a really ideal habitat for them. So probably you've all at least seen bait stations. They use them a lot at the zoos and different types of facilities. Use them a lot in the South, obviously, because we do have a lot of rodents. But they look like this black box here. And what it does is it allows you to put rodent bait inside of a box, but it keeps your dog or other animals that are non-targets outside of the bait or away from the bait so they don't consume it. So these bait stations are relatively inexpensive, but they're an excellent tool in rodent control. You want to put them every 20 to 25 feet around the outside of your rabbitry. You might put a couple inside. I have one near my water source in my barn. And then one near that outside door. You just want to make sure that you're not putting them only inside the facility because you don't want to attract them or bait them to come in if they're not necessarily all inside the rabbitry at that point. Open rabbitries, you might just be baiting around the perimeter. And then you want to really make sure that you're catering, like I said, your application to the type of rodent you're targeting. And so if you have roof rats and things like that, you want to put the bait stations up higher on shelves and things like that instead of down low. Keys here, always wear your gloves when you're handling bait. If you use your bare hands, the rodents will not eat it because it smells like humans. If you chew tobacco, you definitely don't want to touch tobacco and then touch the bait because you'll completely deter the rodents from eating it. And you want to make sure you're managing your bait stations and cleaning them out and washing them every 3 months or so because rodents do have alpha, beta, and omega populations. So there is a dominant and hierarchy, and there's territorial marking. So if your alphas use the bait stations because that's the ideal area, and they urinate in that bait station, the betas and omegas will not go in there unless it's been washed. So if you knock out all your alphas, you're still going to be missing the other two parts of that population unless you're managing your bait stations correctly. There's a lot of different forms of rodenticides. For people that are just getting started, I recommend the bait blocks and soft baits. And these are some products that I use and that I really recommend that are super effective. You can get them at Atwood's, Tractor Supply. You can talk to your local feed store. They can get these in. They are commercial grade products. They're going to be a little bit more effective than some of the stuff that you just see on the store shelf. And it's good to rotate your baits and rotate your active ingredients about twice a year. One bucket of this, if you're putting bait stations every 20 to 25 feet, might cost you $60, but it'll last you for 6 months. So it's a pretty good investment. So next we're going to talk about fly control. I'm going to try to move quickly through this. I know we started a little bit late, but when we talk about fly control, right, we're really focusing on filth flies because that's what we're attracting with manure and extra feed and things like that. That's what's drawn to our rabbitry. And that's a generic name that's referring to a lot of different species within the insect order Diptera. And so these species feed and reproduce on decomposing matter such as garbage, carrion, vegetation, manure, all things that we have around our rabbitries. There are certain biting flies that are also filth flies because they reproduce in decomposing material or manure, but they eat blood meal from animals, livestock, sometimes people. So first step is identifying. You don't really need to be an entomologist here. What you need to do is be able to identify if you have biting flies or flies that have chewing, sucking mouth parts. So the common house fly and bottle flies, blow flies, you see those around trash a lot. They're actually very beautiful. They can be green or amber colored. So those are filth flies that feed on manure, garbage, things like that. So you can actually use fly baits to take care of some of those populations. You cannot use fly baits to attract flies that feed on blood. So any stable fly, flesh fly, things like that, the biting flies, you can tell if they're biting you, obviously, as an indicator, but also if you can catch one or kill one and look, you want to check out those mouth parts. And if you see the piercing, sucking mouth part, you know that you don't want to use fly bait as one of your strategies for fly control. Most likely, if you have biting flies, it's because you've got other types of livestock like horses or donkeys or things around as well, either on your property or your neighbors. Otherwise, houseflies would be the most common infestation that we would see in a rabbitry. So this is a fly life cycle. So, you know, you get eggs, larvae, pupa, you see the larvae in your manure pile, or you're dropping pans a lot. And the key here is, in ideal conditions, the whole life cycle can take only 5 days. So if you're dumping your trays once a week, that's not even fast enough to get rid of the manure out of your facility before the adult flies hatch out. So really paying attention to this, and absolutely cleaning trays at least once a week, if not more frequently, every 5 days, can help you a lot with your fly control strategy. If you have drop hanging cages, trying to clean up your manure, applying barn lime to the piles below, trying to get the moisture level down, all of that can really help. There are insect growth regulators that can be a really excellent tool as well. 80% of your total fly population at any given time is everything except for the adults. Only 20% are the adults. And so when we're looking at successful programs, you do need to look at targeting other life cycle or life stages as well. So same thing as the rodent control, investigate is the second step. You want to look at eliminating trash. You don't want carcasses or anything like that sitting out, because that's just going to attract flies. So if you do have mortality, you need to bury it. Manure pile management, managing manure under your hanging cages, right? You don't want that to build up for years. Ideally, you would be hauling that out and getting it away from your barn. Not leaving extra trash in your trash bins. All those things are important. Non-chemical interventions can be the most important step in this before you're even applying products. So really understanding and limiting the breeding areas is extremely important. Action step, most of us have seen these country vet fly insect killing systems. They're pretty popular in rabbits, and so it's great. Anything that is labeled as pyrethrin is the active ingredient. Well, you want to check the actual product label, but in general, pyrethrins can be applied in the presence of animals, and if they get on animals, it's not going to kill them. So the label should be it should be listed on the label if it's approved for on-animal application. But in general, look for natural pyrethrum type products. They're very effective, and in general, about as safe as you can get for chemicals. And then Quick Stride is a fly bait that I really like. There's other fly baits out there. Again, I recommend rotating them, but that works for house flies. Like I said, pyrethrin products, I use like the LD44 or Dairy Bomb products a lot in my barn to kind of spot hit areas that are needing it. Fly predators, a lot of people in rabbits use these. I recommend them a lot for rabbitries because it's kind of the right livestock density of situation where you can get really good control with using these if you do it correctly. I won't go through the whole life cycle of these fly predators, but basically it's a parasitoid of the housefly that affects the pupal stage. So the adult fly never emerges. Instead, another fly predator will emerge. And so you're helping control your fly populations. These can work on house flies as well as biting flies. And the key here is to apply them early and apply them continuously every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on your fly pressure throughout the fly season. So the country is broken up in zones. There's only a few companies that really sell these, and Spalding Labs is one, I think Organic Cowboy. You can get all the details on their websites. I buy bags of these for like $20 for each bag, and so you want to apply them, throughout spring, summer, and into fall. come in a package kind of like this. These are fly pupae that have the parasitoids in them. You wait until you see some parasitoids hatching, which I have in that circle there on the screen. That's how tiny they are. You see a couple of those pop out, you open the bag and you dump it on your manure pile or any area that you think you're going to have some flies emerging from. Obviously, if you're spraying a lot of insecticide chemicals, you don't want to be applying that in the same area that you're releasing bees, because you will kill the fly predators as well. Anyone has more questions about that? I know a lot about insect control and things like that. This is very high level. I know we're kind of in a time crunch, so you can reach out if you have more questions or want more detail on some of that stuff. I just have one slide on water quality because it is important and people forget about this all the time when it comes to biosecurity. But important, you should know your water source. Surface water can easily become contaminated. There were issues in the poultry industry where they had birds using ponds or surface water, and then that water was going into a facility and it was a point of contamination for high path AI. So paying attention to what your water source is important. I recommend getting your water tested like once a year. And then my other thing is, if we're truly going to have biosecure rabbitries, I know a lot of people love crocs and they're stuck on crocs, but crocs are about the worst thing that you can use for biosecurity because they're always getting contaminated with insects and rodents, especially in Texas, because your insects are all dying to find water sources in the summer, and so are your rats. So I know I've found dead rodents in water buckets in random places on my property. I know it's happening to you guys. I had a photo of a dead rat in a rabbit crock, not in this presentation, but it's terrible for biosecurity. But automatic water systems and water bottles, they are the lowest risk, but they can also become contaminated. So we want to pay attention to replacing your tubing on a regular basis, not every year, but just paying attention to that and trying to sanitize or disinfect the system whenever you can. So that's my spout about water quality. Obviously, that could be a whole topic on its own as well. Kind of getting to the end here, I'll wrap up, but best practices, get started today, do what you can, just start implementing some basic measures, and as that becomes habit, you'll see that you can start implementing some more, but really focus on those 3 different tiers and risk levels. And it's a little bit less overwhelming to start out if you're going to just start with your basic levels and then build out your program for the instance where you're prepared and you know what you're going to do if RHDV2 does get to your area. Continually reevaluate your risk throughout the year, right? I think everybody that's on Facebook or visits the ARBO website is highly aware of where RHDV2 is and constantly is getting notifications about any updates on that. So that's excellent. That's very important. And you can use the poultry industry templates as a guide to get started. There's a lot of free training tools online if you want to learn more about biosecurity in general. And I provide some links for that later in the presentation. Like I mentioned at the beginning, know your limits and how far you're willing to go to protect your animals. We all have to be realistic with ourselves and be prepared and know exactly how much we're willing to spend on these measures in the instance that RHDV2 gets to us, and what we're willing to do and kind of what our threshold is. Don't panic, ask for more information, utilize your resources and get educated. We all have a lot to learn to try to implement these measures, especially people that have outdoor rabbitries and things like that, but there's always stuff that you can do to help limit your risk. And a strong program is only effective if there's understanding, agreement, and compliance from your entire family, hired help, and all visitors. So don't even bother implementing a program if you're going to have a bunch of people or other people in the family running in and out of the facility without using footwear disinfection, things like that. Your program's only as strong as the weakest link, so the whole family needs to be on board. Your hired help needs to be on board. You need to educate them, and there needs to be understanding and agreement from everybody. I heard a veterinarian say once that if your program isn't inconvenient, then you're not doing enough. People don't like biosecurity because it's a pain and it's added time to your chores and all of that. But if it's not causing you inconvenience at all, it means that you're probably not being effective in your program. It's going to be a painful adjustment for all of us in the industry, but if everybody does their part, we're really going to help control disease outbreaks moving forward. These are some resources, and I'll provide the slides so everybody has this information and can look these up if they want to learn more and get the templates and things like that. This is an example of a tool that helped put together. It just lists a ton of different disinfectants, what they're labeled for, and things like that. So it's a good resource for identifying some different products to use. And then if there's any questions, I know we've got a couple minutes left. Otherwise, I can people can email me or whatever if there's additional questions later on.
Hi, Paula. It's Tammy. I had some questions about the time frame, the 60 days versus, I've seen 60 days, 90 days, 120 days for the virus to be still active, or, you know, when you become safe, if you're within 150 miles or, you know, whatever, that kind of time frame I've heard. I think that ARBA has suggested 60 days for an individual, you know, to be able to attend shows within 150 miles, 60 days after the outbreak. Mm-hmm. But then I also saw that if you actually had an outbreak in your barn, that they suggest that you're 4 months before you can go to a show. So I was just trying to understand what we do know so far about RHDV2 and its longevity once an outbreak occurs.
Yeah, so I think there's still, unfortunately, a lot of research that should be done that hasn't necessarily on that disease because it is rabbit specific. I am not by no means an expert in that particular virus, but what we do know is it can withstand a lot in the environment, which is why the recommendation is that if you do have an outbreak at your particular facility or your property, that you should wait months before you purchase additional rabbits or have rabbits there again. When it comes to the 60-day recommendation and the 150-mile radius, like ARBA has, so I put those into kind of my risk assessment, because in that instance, you're looking at where there has been an outbreak in relation to where you are and the amount of time that's gone past since there's been any outbreaks within 150 miles of you. That's because the incubation period of RHDV is very short. So it's not like, for example, COVID, you know, that can be 14 days. So you could have done a number of things in the past 2 weeks where all of a sudden if you test positive today, you really don't know where it came from because that's such a long time frame. With RHDV2, it's within 48 hours, generally within 36 hours that it gets introduced into your facility and you're starting to see mortality. So it is a very short period. And so with the 60 days and not having any outbreaks within 150 miles, I feel that that guidance is reasonable, and I think that those timeframes are reasonable in assessing your risk level for your program, just because the incubation period is so short. If you break at your facility with that virus, you need to take a lot of measures, and mortality needs to be disposed of properly so that it doesn't get into wild rabbit populations if that's not where it came from. The entire facility, all equipment needs to be intensively cleaned and disinfected, and then I would also allow extreme time frame before new animals were introduced, because the virus, once it's there, is very hardy.
Paula, I have my youth kiddo here with me, so my youth exhibitor. We have a question in regard to protecting kits. So she's chosen to vaccinate her rabbits, but the kits cannot be vaccinated until they're 30 days old. So we have to protect those kits until we can get them vaccinated. Do you recommend using metal nest boxes, or what are you recommending doing? Because she's keeping all of the
the moms and the babies are in a whole separate room than all of our other rabbits, but that's just like which one would be better for the biosecurity in your opinion?
So yeah, so I think the number one most important thing is that if you have an enclosed rabbitry, that you're not taking your nest boxes outside and setting them anywhere where wild rabbits could have touched, and then bringing them back into the barn. That's kind of the first and foremost, most important thing, is that if you have a biosecure facility and good entryway control and the nest boxes are staying in your facility, you're much safer regardless of what those boxes are made out of. But in general, wood surfaces are nearly impossible to truly disinfect, so metal is always going to be a better option. I still use wood nest boxes because that's what I have, but I just am more careful about they don't leave the barn. They stay inside. And if I am disinfecting them, I disinfect them inside. They do not go outside.
Thank you.
And another question on the surface cleaning. So you're saying don't rinse. Mostly I'm thinking about those, the trays, the Dura trays. So once everything's clean, you use a disinfectant, you just let it air dry and then put it back in?
So you can rinse if you feel confident that your water is not contaminated or anything. A lot of people are going to do that again to try to get more soil removed from the trays especially. But the ideal practice would be that you're getting all of the urine and stain off of the trays before you apply a disinfectant. So you're doing that with like soap or detergent or whatever you're using to soak them in, and then pressure washing and getting all that off, and then spraying a disinfectant and letting it set in. So it kind of depends what your procedure is, but the key is to get them as clean as possible before you apply the disinfectant.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paula, I'm curious, since you're also a rabbit judge. So let's just take for example that we are following the ARBA rules, if you would, for the timeline and the mileage, like Tammy was referencing, right? So let's just say we're okay, we're safe in that regard, those recommendations. Do you have any things that you've been thinking about, because you're a rabbit judge, that clubs that put together shows together should do to help to, we understand that there's still going to be risks, right? But I mean, you do foot baths for everybody walking in the building? Do you do spray bottles? I mean, do you have any of those initial, sorry, it's kind of a big question, but I just wondered if you have any initial thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the challenge is trying to do foot baths and things like that. Oh, it would be almost pointless if animals are still being brought into the facility, and the animals or the equipment like the carriers is what actually contains virus. Luckily, there's a short incubation period on this, so that helps. But reality is that if you have infected animals and you don't know yet, because it has been only 12 hours or 24 hours, right? You could go to a show and go home before you have any mortality. People are, doing the right thing. It can be an honest transfer, a mistake, and people didn't know. I think if you're having shows, that's all about you personally, the risk that you're willing to take for your animals, because I don't foresee any measures being implemented that are going to significantly reduce risk when there's still going to be a room full of animals coming in from all over the state or surrounding areas. So then it becomes more of a personal decision of what are you willing to do as a breeder? What are you willing to risk? I think, it's a little bit more challenging too when you think about biosecurity and coming back to your own barn, and are you going to have a separate barn for your show animals versus your breeding stock, so that at least if something does happen, you might still have some animals available if the state doesn't mandate euthanasia. So there's a lot of decisions to be made about it, and I don't have plans on taking animals to shows anytime in the near future since convention was canceled, and so I haven't really focused on it. But as far as me going to other shows, if we start judging some places again, there are a lot of measures that judges can take to prevent from bringing it back to their area, such as putting their clothing in plastic bags, making sure it gets washed immediately when you get home, doing disinfection steps on footwear before you ever step into your vehicle, for example, after the airport, going through vehicle washes if you're driving, things like that. Those all can help.
Thank you, Paul. I know that was a big question, so, or you know what I mean, but
Yeah, I don't think there's really a good answer for it, but
I think that's fair. I really do, but thank you. So, anybody else have any questions for Paula? I mean, she's been fantastic, right? Well, Paula, I think as we wrap up here, I just wanted, on behalf of Blackland Prairie, our club, right? So, this was an incredible, very comprehensive presentation, and we clearly appreciate your experience and then also for your love for the hobby as well. So it's just kind of a really a neat combination. So we really thank you, Paula. So
Miss
yeah.
yeah,
That was very good.
it's incredible. Yeah.
Miss Paula, can I ask you one more quick question?
Sure.
Sorry. Whenever we eventually do get back on the table for showing, in general, will the judges take measures for whenever they judge between rabbits? Like I know they do already, but since we do have the RDHB2, with handling, because there is the virus, if that makes sense.
So as a judge, licensed by ARBA, I'm willing to do anything that they're suggesting that we do. As far as recommendations, once people start judging again, if they are wanting to implement hand sanitization or any of that, any type of practice like that between rabbits, it would significantly slow down the process, which is going to affect the clubs a lot. So I don't know how exactly that would all work. We certainly aren't going to be able to change our clothing or our aprons between rabbits, and I think that's where, if you have concerns, you probably only bring vaccinated rabbits to the show, and you need to just fully understand the risks that you're taking attending. But hopefully, you know, as we go through this, we can understand patterns, and there will be a much lower risk times of year to be attending shows versus others and things like that. And hopefully we can kind of learn from how things go this year, and everyone can feel a little bit more secure about it, and hopefully we can get a lower cost vaccine in the United States, and that certainly will help as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, I had one final question about that, also about vaccinated rabbits. I think it's important for all of us to understand what safe measures we have if we are carrying a vaccinated rabbit, because it's my understanding a vaccinated rabbit can still have the virus on their person or body, even though they aren't going to be affected by it. And that itself could infect rabbits that are not vaccinated. I mean, it can spread the disease even if they're vaccinated.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So when we talk about biosecurity and disease transfer, we hear the word fomites a lot, and I know a lot of people have talked about it in the news because of COVID. But a fomite is basically any object. It could be your cell phone, it could be a cat, and a dog, an animal, a bird, anything that can get a virus or microorganism on them and transfer it from one location to another. So that's definitely the case, especially when we're talking about, you know, at shows, there's carpeted tables, things like that, that are very difficult, if at all possible, to do true disinfection on. So the likelihood that you take a rabbit to a show and it comes into contact with that virus, has it on its fur, you bring it back into your barn, that's where the discussion is, if people are going to show regularly, does it make sense for them to have a separate barn or area or whatever it may be for animals going to shows versus their breeding stock?
Thank you. I think it's important to understand why ARBA has said that even vaccinated rabbits can't attend shows if they have an outbreak in their area. Because that's confusing when you first start to think about it, right? But,
Yeah, we all have to kind of move towards the mindset of what we can and should be doing to help everybody in the greater good and the industry as a whole, and not just for themselves, because if we're all just thinking about ourselves and our own herds, you know, we need to understand what we're willing to do, but we're not going to prevent outbreaks if we're not working together.
Which makes it very important to be aware of what's going on around us, not just in our own barns.
And I have noticed that few states are asking for health certificates for out-of-state exhibitors.
Yeah, unfortunately, like, my personal opinion is that there's not enough veterinarians that are well versed in rabbits in general as it is, but also it's a virus that basically a lot of times the first sign that you have it in your barn is going to be death. And so it would be very difficult to actually see and diagnose this type of disease in particular with just popping in at the vet before you actually have mortality.
too bad there's not a magic light, you know,
Yeah.
that can see the virus.
Too bad we don't have that for COVID as well.
Yeah, for sure.
This is very helpful though, because I mean, I'm hoping that we'll continue to learn from each other as we go. You know, we're all going to learn together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're 15 minutes past the hour.
Yeah.
We need to let Paula go. We
Yeah,
can't kidnap her all night, but we really appreciate you, Paula.
Paula, you were amazing. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, no
Thank you very
problem.
much, Paula. Thank you. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good evening,